Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons, your favorite tabletop role-playing game, RPG, news, reviews, interviews, etc., etc. We made it through 2024, and I'm Shawn Merwin here with Teos Abadia. Hey, Teos.
Happy New Year almost. Happy New Year to listeners.
Happy New Year. If you're hearing this and your name is not Shawn or Teos, then it is probably the new year. And so it was numerologically, I noticed that this is episode 222 of you and I as co-hosts, but episode 111 of Mastering Dungeons. So that worked out interestingly. I think that means we're half as good as we once were.
Yeah, it's as foretold by prophecy. If Mastering Dungeons records its 222nd and 111th episode simultaneously,
yeah,
car-sized drones will attack New Jersey. It's our fault.
I welcome my Transformer overlords.
They are more than meets the eye.
That's true. That's true. And as are we, and as are our listeners. So thank you, everyone out there, for listening. We hope that your holidays have gone well, and we hope that your 2025 kicks off with I don't want to say a bang, because bangs could be good, could be bad, depending. So yeah, kicks off well. How's that?
Kicked mine off by getting a copy of The Psychology of Dungeons and Dragons, Jamie's book from our host from last show. A lot of people said they bought the book based on our show, which wow, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I've been perusing my copy, my multiple copies, and amazing thing. It was great to have Jamie on last week, and it is great to be back with you this week. And it's great to be back with all our listeners who sometimes send us questions. They send us questions via our Patreon Discord, via YouTube, via Mastodon, via Bluesky, via email at masteringdnd@gmail.com, sometimes in real life, sometimes they'll pass them in the grocery store and say, hey, I had a question. Conventions, wherever. Send us your questions if you have them. And the Welsh DM did via Bluesky, asking, does the 5e Vancian magic system actually limit the narratives we can tell? Is its strict rigidity actually a hindrance to storytelling in tabletop role-playing games? And so my first thought was, well, any system by definition limits what's allowable because that's what systems do. But I think if we get rid of that semantic argument, it's a good question to look at how Vancian magic systems can guide play and therefore guide the stories that come from that play. But let's step back for a second, Tez.
Yeah.
Why do we say Vancian magic system? What does that mean?
Because Gygax read stories from Jack Vance and was enamored with it, as with various other parts of fiction of the day.
Yep. So Jack Vance was a fiction writer, sci-fi fantasy writer. There was a particular collection of stories called The Dying Earth. And in those stories, wizards, in order to cast spells, would need to first sit down with their spell book and do these magical rituals that would transfer the power of the spell from the book into their brains. Then, when they cast the spell, that power came out, and they could not cast that spell again until they sat down, reread the book, and delivered it back into their brains. And Gygax was obviously a fan. Vecna is also a anagram of Vance. And so that's how important Jack Vance's magic and his system and his stories were to the game. So what happened in AD&D was, based on your level, you could memorize a certain number of spells at each level and also have a certain number of spells in your spell book. So after resting, before you went on your adventure, you would need to sit down and memorize spells. I think the first book said 15 minutes per spell level. So, if you're a low-level caster, you're maybe spending an hour, 2 hours. If you're a high-level caster, you're spending most of your day
In days, even
memorizing spells.
I recall
Yeah,
during play that our high level adventures, and this could possibly be when we're playing like a really like 23rd level or something like that. But I remember we needed like I'd say more than a day and a half. I want to say like
yeah,
it was weird how long it could take you when you were totally drained, especially if you did things like pilot a spelljammer, which back then required eating up all your spell slots the moment you
right.
sat on it. That was wild.
Yeah. So another thing was, if you're used to playing more recent editions where you just have slots and you can slot in any spells that you have prepared, this was you had to pick the spell and you could memorize memorize it once, twice, three times, four times, but that was what you cast. So say you had four slots that you could memorize a first level spell in. If you wanted to cast four magic missiles, you had to memorize four magic missiles. And if you got to a point where you needed a detect magic spell, you were out of luck. You should have memorized at least one detect magic instead of using all four of your potential slots to memorize magic missile. So as you can see, that was super limiting. And while I don't want to go as far as saying that the Vancian system uh, limited storytelling, but it definitely shaped it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, over the years, we've gone from that truly Vancian system to a system of sort of a Vance like system
A
where you
menu of
have
options. Yeah.
right, you have slots and you can choose on the fly those slots as you go, uh, which gives you a ton more flexibility than you had back in those first edition AD&D days.
Yeah.
So I can't I don't want to say currently that it limits it, but it does provide a framework within which magic is supposed to work. So
Mhm.
you are limited by not just the Vancian memorize and forget slot system, but by there being spells in the first place, if that makes sense. So you can't just summon up a ball of magic and do anything you want with it. It has to go through one of these channels that says this is a spell.
Yeah, yeah. There was a fun conversation in our Discord too about what is magic and how do you represent it and what kind of storytelling you can do. And so we've had various explanations over the years for Dungeons and Dragons, but the sort of prevalent Forgotten Realms one is this idea of the weave, and you're pulling at
Mhm.
sort of mystical strands, and by learning magic, you learn sort of how to pull on these strands and turn it into a spell like comprehend languages or whatever it might be, rather than it being for some other reason, right? It's not unlocking a set of runes, right? A pattern that you learned in a book, and now you can cast it whenever, or that it uses up your life essence, or some other thing like that, right? There are various ways it could be, but it isn't. And I think when I look at this question, what I think of is that D&D, as usual, is flexible enough to please most people in most of the time. So it works
Mhm.
pretty well, which is why you see it pretty much emulated by other RPGs as well. Like it's surprising how
Right.
close it is. Like it tweaks it, but it's still kind of that kind of slot-like system or
Mhm.
something similar. And very seldom is it just, freeform, tell me what you do with your magic, right? As you
Right.
might see more in some movies and media like that. And I think the reason is that there's this conflicting desire between magic is a thing you do the way a barbarian does a thing
Mhm.
or
Yep.
somebody else does a thing, right? And so it can't be so world shaking and freeform because nobody else in the party gets to do that either, or we'd have to all do weird freeform things, including the barbarian. And
Mhm.
what would and we don't quite know how to handle that. So there's partly that, and
Right.
also that because magic is supposed to be like, well, a lot of the game is combat, so it's the way you fight. It
Yep.
needs to kind of slip into that and then be utility things every now and then, just like the rogue and the barbarian do utility things every now and then. So it's trying to
Yep.
confine itself while being evocative and interesting and all these things. It's trying to do all that. And it actually kind of does it fairly surprisingly well. Like
Yeah.
when you really think of it, like it's not bad. We can cast our powerful spell and feel good about it, but now the next person gets to go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's not a hindrance to storytelling. It's the game has decided that this is the kind of story that the game
Yeah.
will provide. So within that structure, it does all the things that it's supposed to do. So you need to solve a particular problem. Here are the tools to solve that problem. That problem may be solved by a wizard spell or a ranger's ability to survive in the desert.
Yeah.
It may be solved by a spell or the rogue's ability to disarm a trap or open a lock.
Yeah.
Right. And so it gives you the tools to do the things that the stories you tell with the game are supposed to tell.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and if you did something more freeform, you'd probably have to have such a nebulous set and confined set of results that you're still it's still a system that would try to what do you call it? Like confine its abilities, right? You can't just say like, what would you like to do with my magic? Well, I will shatter my enemies every time.
Yeah. Right. And if you have a system where the players can do that, as Teos said, you either then need to either have everyone be that or give people who aren't that something that is comparable, or the thing that you do is unique, but the risks involved in that
Yeah.
are so strong that then that becomes a story of, oh, I can just shatter my enemies. But if I fail, I shatter myself.
Right. Right.
Right.
Or I'm so
Then
worn
there's
out that I'm incredibly vulnerable to everybody. And that has often not played super well, right? Yeah, it's interesting.
exactly. And this really leads us pretty quickly into our next question from Sam Fries via email. And Sam emailed masteringdnd@gmail.com to ask this question. In the question mega show, there was a really good discussion around the character skills versus player skills. The low charisma barbarian with a high charisma player. As you were discussing this, I found myself thinking about the Forged in the Dark systems of action rolls, the position and the effect system, where a given roll accounts for both how hard it is to do this and how much would this action success influence the world. In practice, I think this is similar to how I adjudicate the problem when DMing. The DC and effect of the roll is dynamic based on how good the player's idea is and how good their character is at doing the thing. When you have the eloquent player making an argument as playing the barbarian, I'm lowering the DC a bit to account for how good the argument is. Conversely, if the quiet player just wants to roll, it'll be more like a standard DC then. This scales all the way down to a trivial, I look behind the painting on the wall equals you automatically find the hidden vault without having to roll, and up to, I attempt to belittle the king into doing what I want by insulting his mother, equaling, that's impossible, but let's see how poorly this goes for you. I haven't thought critically about this particular aspect of my DMing. Does this vibe as a reasonable approach for addressing these ludonarrative disconnects? What questions would you ask about an actual system for translating how good an idea is this and how good are you at this into DCs? Does it seem valuable to try to formalize, or is it best left hand wavily to DM discretion? I love the word hand wavily.
And Waverly is good.
Yes, hand waving is now an adverb. Thanks for the many hours of fascinating discussion. So great question. And it's a totally reasonable question. And doing that, taking what the players give you and then deciding the difficulty class and how to handle the game of it is one way to sand down those ludonarrative dissonance moments. Because the story, i.e., what the characters say, will then influence the game, what the players need to roll, which then potentially goes back to being the game translating what the story does after the rolls are made. So that's a strength of a more conversational style game where it's a back and forth between the game master and the player. What do you want to do? Okay, you want to do that. Let me think. Let's talk this through. If you tried this and succeed, what happens? If you try this and fail, what's the consequence? How difficult should this be? Great if you have players that love that conversation, love that storytelling. Bad if you want to run a fast game where there isn't a lot of that give and take. And as Teo said earlier, that's why D&D tends to be so popular, is because there is a form of consistency in the system where you either have a set number that you know you're rolling against, the armor class of a monster. You have a set DC for certain checks. Standard lock, say DC 15. Or it's easily found. Oh, you're trying to stealth past the bugbears? I have their perception right here. Let me roll versus your check. Or let me use their passive against your check. That's quick.
Yeah.
That conversation can take a lot of time.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well when we review Ethan Yen's blog post on skills. But there are a lot of systems that try to do this. The Cypher system from Monte Cook Games and all their kind of offshoot games try to do this. The Free League games often try to do this, where they try to say, they try to handle this, right, by saying, everybody who tries to do this must hit this particular DC. And in the Free League games, it's often, oh, you're rolling a D6, you've got to hit a 4 or something similar like that. So there's sort of a universal, everything is hard level 4 almost always. And if not, the DM will announce it because it's strangely hard, right? Mm-hmm. And Savage Worlds is also like this as well. And then you as a hero get some slight bonus as to your opportunity to carry this off, but you may have a skill, or you may have a tool, or you may have circumstances or whatever. And all of these things do something. Like they may give you more dice, or they may give you a bonus to your roll, or they may reduce the DC, or something like that, right? So in Monte Cook Games, it all starts impossible, and then it all gets whittled down to where you don't even need to roll. Is a funny thing to do in Cypher system, right? And that's that idea. But D&D is architected differently. And while I think it's totally fine what's being done in this question, that's fun. Ultimately what you're saying is, I just know you're going to make this because you're so good. So I'm lowering the DC of reality for you. But if the other player tries it, then I'm not. And that's that there are cases where I think that will cause some friction. Mm-hmm. Right? You gave the bard a pass, but you're not giving me a pass. Can be a little bit of it can be strange. And you're kind of doing things to the curve of the math, which doesn't matter if you're having fun, but if it were a policy, if it were a firm part of the game, I think would cause friction for various situations, right?
Yeah, it's the what works for your game and your players addendum to any rule.
Yeah.
But by making the rule, you are making the world.
Yeah.
And like you say, Teos, D&D expects you to, on these, not the microtransaction checks of combat, but on these larger checks of opening doors, picking locks, finding traps, it expects you to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of a weird game in that there are supposed to be these consequences for failing, but there never really are for a good percentage of the thing, right?
True.
Because you overcome them in some way, or the story is better if you succeed, so you just succeed. Because we want you to find the secret door because that's where the adventure is. We want you to get the king or queen to agree to your terms because that's where the adventure is.
Right. Yeah, so and it's about the effort and you doing it and the role playing that goes with it and all that, rather than just it's not a random chance. And in fact, even when DMs don't quite think about the DCs they're assigning, they really are often assigning probabilities that are almost always within reach, because that's the kind of point of it. Now, the dice are also big enough, that giant D20, to be swingy. So sometimes you get that surprise and you deal with it, and that can be great in some cases, and sometimes it's abysmal.
Just awkward.
Yeah, just awkward, right? It all hinges on this one diplomatic decision you make, and you make your plea and you roll a 1, and okay, let's explain that.
Yeah, yeah. So in in many ways, we come from an organized play background where you sort of want things to happen
Mm.
in a way that is reasonably close from table to table. You don't want one DM making the DC 5 and another DM making it a DC 20 based on anything, based on role play, based on situation. You want it to be that, because that's how games are supposed to work, right?
Right.
You're supposed to play sort of by the same rules. So it's that the ludonarrative dissonance is always there, and you sort of have to figure out how much of it you can accept as the game master, how much the players are willing to accept as players, and find the happy medium for your game. But as a game designer, you still have to do the hard work of, all right, if it's a D6 roll and you succeed on a 4, 5, or 6, what resources am I giving the players to lower that to a 3, to lower that to a 2? And each time I do, it's 16.7% chance more that they're going to succeed. What sort of threshold do I want in my game for those things? And that then dictates how many resources you're going to give players to be able to fudge that number or fudge the probabilities.
Yeah, I recall a living Greyhawk adventure in the Jeff region that took you into the Barrier Peaks Mountains. And those of you who think of that name will go, okay, well, there's a spaceship up there, right? And so, a little bit as a joke, there was in a scene a metal door that you could possibly spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like the fools that they are, the adventure authors and the admins and whatever assigned a DC to opening the lock that they considered to be impossible.
Yeah.
Which, of course, players then proceeded to hit at least one table at the premiere of the adventure.
Sure.
And the adventure had to be rewritten later because the reality is there was nothing behind it, right? And there were a couple of adventures that were like that, where someone would assign a DC thinking nobody can hit it, but they forget about all the, especially in third edition, all the stacking things that could lead to success. And the like I've often said, like if you don't want an NPC to be killed, you don't give it stats. Because as soon as you do, battle can be had, right? But you need to just have it statless and describe it as having some way of getting away or something like that, because you can't give somebody a DC because they will hit it.
Yeah. So decide beforehand whether you're playing a game or telling a story, and then err to the side of whichever of those things that you are doing. If you're telling the story, then let the story that's playing out affect the game. If you're playing a game, then play the game and let the story flow naturally from the roles in that game, and move the lever as necessary.
Yep.
Okay, let's get into our news and commentary now, starting with a bigger than expected monster manual, according to Christian Hoffer of EN World. Christian writes an article on EN World saying that next year's monster manual will include over 85 new monsters, an increase over what was previously believed. A description of the monster manual also confirms that there will be over 300 new images for the book. These new stat blocks that are coming in will either mostly add higher CR monsters or lower CR variants of existing popular monsters. So the example is there will be several low CR vampire variants to represent freshly turned vampires, along with a higher CR vampire called a Nightbringer, who can be a threat to those higher level PCs out there. And of course, the Monster Manual is coming on the 18th of February of 2025.
Shawn, what this means is, once again, Wizards of the Coast has invented the technology to fold space so that you can have more art, more subjects, bigger font. You can have your stat blocks now have this big row of blocks in multicolors for the saving throw bonuses and whatnot. That's amazing. I think this technology should be applied. I call on Wizards of the Coast to release the keys to this technology that they have so that other companies can employ it as well.
Mm-hmm. So we can exist on a different plane of
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah, this ability to pack more into a book with larger font and more images, it's incredible. I salute them.
Yeah. Well, they're also cramming more money into D&D, apparently, according to CNBC, which had an article about D&D's financial and social success. You want to take us through this one, Teos?
Yeah, the headline of this video was How Dungeons and Dragons Help Bring in Over 1 Billion. And the CNBC video interviews players, store owners, Wizards of the Coast staff to establish how D&D has grown as a brand. And there's some really cool stats on here. Baldur's Gate 3 grossed an estimated $1.7 billion on Steam. But then later they say the game earned Wizards of the Coast $90 million in royalties in the last half of 2023 alone. So it's always interesting how billions become millions, and in fact, double-digit millions is sort of impressive. Wizards of the Coast estimated 85 million people worldwide have played D&D since 1974. One thing that's really neat and different was they interview a Brooklyn store gaming shop that has brought in nearly 110,000 in 2024 from hosting D&D game nights alone, they say. And they host 20 D&D games a week. And they say that the D&D is 50% of their revenue, which is pretty unusual, and that it saved the store. And they talk about, they started, I guess, right when the pandemic hit. So it was a big, difficult situation for them. And the D&D has really helped them climb out of this. They also talked to Maya Research, a market research firm that estimates that 54% of D&D players are between 15 to 29 years old. That includes you and I. The Brooklyn store says most people coming in have never played D&D before. And in the video, it says that there's been a 320% rise in the tabletop RPG market since 2016. The graph starts with 50 million for revenue in the tabletop RPG area in 2016, and then gets to around 250 million in 2023. Since 2019, they point out that Wizards of the Coast revenues, that's not just D&D, has increased 54% from 761 million to 1.5 billion in 2023, and then a slightly lower 1.2 billion in 2024, but still 761 to 1.2, sizable increase across the years for Wizards, which is much more than D&D, but they say D&D is an active part of that. They say they then go on to quote a number of people talking about how there are things outside of Wizards that are driving this as well. And maybe even more so, it's left as a sort of question. It's a somewhat implied. And actual play is the big one they focus on. They mentioned Dimension 20's Arena event where they sold out Madison Square Garden. And something like 17,000 tickets. I'm not sure that's the actual number of tickets. That may be what Madison Square Garden seats. But they say, something like 17,000 tickets at an average price of 119. That's impressive math. And then more solid math, one of the Dimension 20 podcasts, Worlds Without Number, has a Patreon with 30,800 members paying $5 for roughly 150,000 a month that's coming in, right? 150K a month.
It's also what we're making.
Yeah, it's very close.
Yeah.
So, and then it kind of closes with this idea that the game's popularity comes down to community and sort of saying for Wizards, kind of suggesting that for Wizards, for the D&D brand and for those companies that are involved in it, it comes down to that community that you can create and the excitement you can create that proves whether it's worth paying for. And I thought that was a kind of a neat way to end it in this video.
Yeah. That part, I mean, all of this is amazing information. And that part about community really, really resonates, because you and I have seen the power of community over the years. And it's not even always a community that Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro can create on their own.
Yeah.
It's a community that they can help facilitate others in creating.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think they hopefully will be focused on going forward. And we'll talk more about that in our main segment today. But we have more content here. We have the Full Moon Storytelling blog talking about using third places. Okay, it's a little bit of an older blog from 2023, but it was shared again on Mastodon, where a friend of the show, Dave Clark, discusses using, quote, third places, locations where cross-cultural, cross-class, or even cross-character class people can gather. Now, I didn't read this, but I assume third place is first place would be your home, second place would be work or school, and then third place is where you interact with people outside of those two.
Yeah, and the idea is if you think of like old timey life, you'd say like, okay, the market, right? That in a traditional town back way when, doesn't matter what your social class is, you'd come to the market or you'd come to the tavern or something like that. If you think of like an old Irish pub or something like that, everybody in town goes there, right? So these third spaces are places where anybody can meet. And what Dave's talking about here, which is a kind of neat idea, is saying, a lot of times we might make fun of like starting in a tavern, but that actually makes a lot of sense because it kind of doesn't matter what your character backstory is. Coming to the tavern makes sense, right? Versus if you said you all meet in the castle, the barbarian might say like, me, the castle, why? And so it's talking about the importance of these sort of places and how they change over time. Like the U.S. had a time when bowling alleys might be the third place, or the mall, right? And now my kids are like, the mall? What are you even talking about? Cafes, they might say, would work now, right? And so these places can work as backstory locations that tie people together, right? What did you all? How has the market been important to all of you? Is a question you could ask the characters, and they would probably be able to answer, right? Or in a more modern game, something like this cafe where everybody would gather, something like that. And so they're world building tools to think of these places particularly as ways to appeal to many types of characters, even NPCs, and to create interesting plots feeding off of them by thinking through that. These are places where people gather, right? Yeah, cool.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah. And you can find that at fullmoonstorytelling.com. And we also have something from the Bell of Lost Souls about how to do a character voice. Teos notes they have far too many ads there, but they do have a very nice blog on the various techniques to do a character voice without needing to master an accent. And some of the tips they provide there are use repeated catchphrases and sayings to promulgate an understanding of a character. Impersonate a character you know well from other media. Change your normal volume, pitch, and rhythm while speaking. Use an archetype like Batman Vigilante or Femme Fatale or nerd or bad boy or nosy neighbor to get the character's personality across. Consider their primary emotion, such as anger or happiness. And finally, be confident and carry through regardless of how you're feeling or how you're doing in the moment.
Yep, absolutely. That's one I often turn to whenever my voice starts to stray and I start becoming another NPC, trying to turn it back towards the original. I do that. Like I had a friend who had two old guy voices, and they would often cross over, and it was fun, and we'd all smile when like it became voice two, old guy two came in and into play.
Yep. And if you think, oh, but I'm great at accents, I will give you this tip. You're doing your accent with your home group and everybody's happy and it sounds great. Think about then going to a convention or going to a public place and DMing for someone from the place that your accent is, because that happens a lot when you game master publicly, especially at larger conventions. When you may travel to, say, England to run a show, that English accent that you thought was just killer may not go over as well while you're actually game mastering for a player that has that particular accent.
Killer will become a different type of term.
True story. And speaking of killers, we have a couple killer things in our creator corner, starting with Jeff Stevens Publishing, who is about to launch a Kickstarter called Weapons of Lore. This will be PDF or print on demand, as well as for Roll20, Foundry VTT, and Shard Tabletop. It is in preview mode right now, but the Kickstarter launches on the 14th of January of 2025. And you can go there now, of course, and be subscribed to be told when it launches. What is Weapons of Lore, you ask? Well, it's a 5e supplement containing magical weapons for you to divvy out as treasure, apply to enemies, or trade in merchant establishments, including 40 weapons of lore, weapons that increase in power as the attuned creature advances in power, 40 traditional weapons in the style of traditional magic weapons with properties and no advancement, 20 cursed weapons, weapons that give and take, 20 rechargeable weapons, weapons with limited charges that can be replenished by completing rituals or other tasks, and then finally encounter ideas to help you introduce these weapons into your game. Again, that Kickstarter will launch about 2 weeks from you hearing this episode when it drops.
Yeah, I love how Jeff tackles weapons and the ideas behind them. So I wholeheartedly endorse it, having not seen it.
Okay. And second creator corner is Ethan Yen, who in a blog talked about different RPG approaches to skills. You want to take this with Teos?
Yeah, it's timely based on our earlier conversation. And so on ethanyen.com, Ethan talks about how different RPGs provide an approach to saying, hey, you're good at this, right? Versus how somebody else may or may not be that good at it. And so he kind of puts together a chart that has 4 different boxes, and the titles kind of go across, intersecting on these 2 axes. One is whether you have skill ranks. So some RPGs will say you can improve your skills by having, rank 1, rank 2, whatever it is. While other RPGs have a binary approach that say you have the skill or you don't. And skill ranks allow character definition. So there's some great positives, right? I'm a master tracker. And varying levels of competency, right? I am okay at diplomacy, and someone else says, well, I'm an expert at it, right? But the math can be intimidating or problematic, and it can mean that not having a bonus can shut down a player. I don't have a bonus in diplomacy, so I don't want to talk, right? Mm-hmm. And so he talks about these issues and looks at that axis. Then on the other axis, he looks at having a list of skills to choose from and how this defines play. So if you know you can pick a lock, maybe, and we get into one of our earlier questions, that means that you think the only way to interact with a lock is to pick it, and forget that you could bash the door or the chest or convince someone to open it for you or some other way of looking at it, because you kind of turn to your skill list to solve all the problems in the game. If you go the other way and you have a freeform approach to skills, now you may be able to define what your character does, but that can also lead to some interactions not being covered. And I thought it's a really cool read to go over this. It made me think a lot about games like Gumshoe that have an kind of alternate approach where you say, yes, I am skilled at shooting, but everybody's rolling a d6 to shoot, and everybody succeeds on a 4. But what you're doing, maybe it's a 3, I forget which one, I think it's a 4. But what you get to do is to burn points to succeed when you want to. And eventually you'll run out of points, and the points are equal to your skill ranks. So if you have a 6 in shooting, 6 times, or 6, you could give 6 pluses at any number of times until you run out of them. And that kind of lets you be competent as in a spy movie, but only so many times. And someone who doesn't have very many points can still hit that one shot they need to hit. And that's a very interesting take on it, right? Free league games we talked about that have that low threshold of success, but skills or equipment or whatever lowers that and makes it easier. 13th Age feels a lot like D&D, but you get to say what your skills are on a very broad level. Like, I am a master linguist, or I worked in a royal court. I was a sailor, right? And then your DM just says, yeah, okay, I'll give you a boost because of the fact that you have that skill background, right? That the definition of who your character is. So it was very interesting to think about this, and I love the way Ethan picks apart game aspects, and this is definitely a good read.
Yep, Ethan is a great designer, a great thinker, very creative. I have his little
oh yeah,
with Kelly Tran made Fetch My Blade. It was just happened to be sitting on my desk, so I thought I'd give that a little plug as well.
And I have one last plug that I forgot to make, which is
Yeah.
I've been playing this.
Ooh,
It's the
Clank
Clank.
Acquisitions Incorporated 2.
Yeah, so this is the Direwolf board game that's the sequel to the first part. It is an incredible game that is like Clank, if you know that game of trying to explore before the dragon comes, but also fully steeped in Acquisitions Incorporated and developing your franchise. This time around, one that Jim Dark Magic is heading up, and then with lots of store and laughter. Like, it's amazing. My family's playing through it. We just did like the first 2 missions. The amount of laughing we do is incredible. It really is. So I so far highly recommend this as an awesome thing. This was my gift for the family, and it's been really great.
Awesome. Awesome. So that is our news and commentary segment.